Hey guys, so I'm back with another whiteboard video. I had two topics the last time, which were, well, we started with thyroid, and then the last time was talking about hypogonadism, testosterone, and the other topic that I was asked to cover was spotting stress on lab work, so things that you can look at. Now, I'll cover some other topics too, but I wanted to get to this one first. So I want to go over just some basic things that you can look for on lab work to actually see if your body's stressed systemically. So, you know, sometimes it's hard to be objective when looking at stress. So sometimes if you have quantifiable numbers in front of you that you can see, it makes it a little bit easier, and then you can kind of figure out how to address it, or at least that it's there and that it's chronic. Because acute stress versus chronic stress is going to be two different things. I'll talk a little bit about how those two things might impact you differently in terms of what you're going to see. So again, the goal here is not to give you every single hormone feedback loop necessarily, but to let you know some of the stuff that you can look at when you're looking at labs. So first off, cortisol, obviously, that's the big one that everyone is familiar with. Blood versus urine. So yes, you can look at cortisol, blood levels of cortisol, right? Cortisol secretion varies up and down throughout the day, so blood levels aren't going to be very accurate. You can have 24-hour collection done with urine, for example. You can have AM cortisol done, which is okay, and it kind of shows a waking response, right? I mean, it's not perfect, it's not right when you wake up, but it does give you some insight, and I'll use that sometimes. When someone's already having lab work done or blood work done, we might add that on there. But really, urine's going to be better looking at least a 4-point cortisol. So that's where, you know, I talk about the Dutch test. That's where that comes in handy. You can actually look at cortisol patterns throughout the day, and then also in the urine, it will show different metabolites that you're not going to see in the blood, right? Because you metabolize and excrete through the urine, so that allows you to see that. Now, first off, you think stress, high cortisol, right? Yes, so it will elevate in response to stress. That's exercise, that's psychological stressors, so physical or psychological, emotional, whatever, it's going to go up, right? And then it will go back down. However, chronically elevated is the issue right now. And then chronically elevated can also lead to burnout or fatigue. You know, we won't use the word adrenal fatigue in a scientific reference here because people get mad at me, but yeah, it can lead to adrenal insufficiency, in that you just can't produce cortisol anymore because you're burnt out. Now there are autoimmune diseases or issues that can cause this, that can cause disruptions in cortisol. So Addison's being low, Cushing's being high, they're not very common. Normally it's kind of self-induced, right? Because of chronic stress in some way, shape, or form. And I'll link back to that here as we go down. So electrolytes. This is one that might sound weird, but if you think about what happens to aldosterone levels when cortisol elevates, when we see high stress, we might see higher aldosterone, we might see a disruption in electrolytes, which is, your body's going to balance that out short term, right? However, in people that are chronically stressed, I do sometimes see imbalance in electrolytes on lab work. Usually sodium, potassium, but you might see chloride, for example, imbalanced in there too. But yeah, you might see take potassium, for example. You may see low potassium, you may see high potassium. It depends on if your cortisol is high or low. So, you know, high is going to yield a higher aldosterone, and it's going to act differently than low cortisol, which could also lead to electrolyte imbalance, right? So if you see electrolyte imbalances in the absence of kidney issues, for example, or like extreme dehydration, then you might start connecting dots, and if stress is present, could be related, okay? So that's one that's missed a lot, but I do see that on labs, and if I can catch that cue in there, along with some other things, it's nice to kind of give me a little more data, right? So hormone imbalances. Now, that could be a number of things. So we've talked about feedback loops, and we talked about how everything's interconnected. You can see my little makeshift chart here at the bottom, which I'll talk about a little bit more. But common things you might see if you watch the thyroid lesson: stress, inflammation can cause poor conversion of T4 to T3. So you might see high reverse T3, could be one, right? Estrogen dominance, which I'll talk about down here. You might see elevation of inflammatory markers too with chronic stress. It can happen. So there's a number of things, you know, in terms of inflammation that you might see, but just some common ones, right? These are the typical ones that I see, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about like what estrogen dominance actually is in a nutshell. Okay, now I'll skip over this one because I'll do that one last, but we'll get down to white blood cells. So white blood cell count, you get someone that's chronically stressed, compromised immune function, right? So I would normally see suppressed white blood cells in people that are chronically stressed. Now, if you're fighting infection or something like that, you might have elevation, right? But people that are normally chronically stressed, have inflammation, have these things for an extended period of time to where it's becoming an issue and it's disrupting other things in the loop, low. Normally going to see it low. So that's one thing I'll look at when I'm looking at healing people that are stressed out and people that have hormonal issues too. If they have low white blood cells, we'll keep an eye on that over time. They usually come up some, right? Okay. Assuming that they don't have like some kind of immune system dysfunction or disorder that might be attacking the immune system. Okay, so hormone imbalances or metabolite issues or metabolism issues, conversion issues. So common one that you may see is estrogen dominance. I see this. It happens in males too. It seems to be more common in females. They're a little bit more fragile, and it's easier to see it in females too, and point it out because typically it impacts the menstrual cycle, right? So what you're what you're seeing here is they're kind of your body's kind of stealing this progesterone. What's happening is so here, I don't know if you guys can read this on here, but you see mineral corticosteroids, right? So cortisol, cortisone, things like that, metabolites. So these two, and I put, as you'll see here, progestogens or progestogens. It depends on where you read it to be spelled differently, but they come from pregnenolone, so they come from the same kind of mother hormone. And you need to maintain a balance of progesterone to estrogen. So obviously, once that balance is disrupted and you have a chronically high level of estrogen, or just the ratio is thrown off, right? Then you end up with estrogen dominance. So with high cortisol kind of takes the priority, right? It's first priority because in our body we need cortisol. It needs to happen quickly in response to stress issues. So progesterone will kind of take a back seat, right? And then once we end up with high demand for cortisol production, progesterone starts getting robbed, essentially. And that's when you end up with this issue. And then also, unfortunately, what can happen is here, if we're looking at androgens, right? A couple things that can happen with androgens that it's probably worth pointing out. So if you are looking at some more advanced testing, like a Dutch test, right, that will show urinary metabolites, or Life Extension makes one that shows urinary metabolites, you might see some issues with androgen issues, like 5-alpha reductase is one that people might be familiar with. That's going to be conversion into DHT, for example, androstenedione. So if we were to draw this, if this was our 5-alpha and we were going off in a couple different directions, we may see high androgens, right? So we may see one of these or both of these androgens high. So PCOS, there can be issues there, or people that have stress-induced hyperandrogenism, right? So you may see that. And then also, if that chronic stress can kind of play into aromatase activity. So right here, right, people that are familiar with testosterone's conversion to estrogen. So you might see this more in men because in females, right, they produce their own estrogen through their ovaries, though they do still aromatize. You know, they do still have, there is still aromatase activity. It's just that they produce a lot of their estrogen through the ovaries, whereas males primarily rely on aromatase and or aromatization to get their estrogen. So it's a little different, but concept is similar in that, you know, if we have more aromatase activity, then of course we're going to have higher estrogen, even more estrogen dominance. Okay, so those are some things to look at. Those are just, again, there's other things. I mean, there's a lot that, like I said, there's a lot that goes on in that feedback loop, but I just wanted to provide some basic markers that you can look at and understand without a lot of knowledge of endocrinology and like an advanced experience in reading lab work and things like that. Just some things that you might be able to point out. And then if you need additional help, you know, you contact somebody like myself, and I do go over tons of stuff like this on lab work pretty regularly. So, or a professional, right? Or a endocrinologist would be good, right? So again, recap, cortisol, right? Acute versus chronic, what that can do long-term, high, and then maybe eventually low, how that can impact aldosterone levels, how that can impact electrolytes, even in the absence of any type of kidney issue. Common hormone imbalances that you might see, high RT3, estrogen dominance, maybe potentially elevation in inflammatory markers, hormone conversion issues. Here I talked about that. And then another one, white blood cell counts. So those are common ones. There are others, but these are the ones that I probably see most often. I wanted to pick 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things, kind of throw those at you. So I hope that's helpful.